Hey everyone, after 23 rounds, it is time for the big finale of Grading the Avengers. If you haven't, I recommend you check out this series from the beginning rather than the end. For those of you that don't know, we've been going through every Avengers comic that ever existed, so if you're curious about that, if you're interested in that, you can click on the button in the top right corner here. You should also subscribe to Comic Island for more videos on comic news, reviews, and much more. Now, let's begin with my thoughts on Jason Aaron's Avengers, before we see how it scores with my personal grade relative to Avengers history. So, after an astounding 23 rounds, we are finally here at the present day with Jason Aaron's Avengers. A long run of comics that have been going for a few years now, but very much still feels like an active thing. That presented an interesting challenge to this series, with me basically just having to constantly stay on top of the Avengers throughout the rest of these videos coming out, checking up with the current comics to make sure my grades were up to date. And that was important to do because it did change my grades and as such other grades over time, with quite a few Avengers stories having come out since I started this series. When I started grading the Avengers, the series was in the middle of this whole thing with Moon Knight, and since then they've had a story arc with the Phoenix Force, and then this whole big crossover event thing in the form of Heroes Reborn. Aaron seems to be with the Avengers for a bit, and this won't be changing anytime soon. I am reasonably confident though at this point that my final grade for this run will be a bit firm going forward. It's stayed consistent since the Moon Knight story, but it is worth noting things could change. His comics could really become different in terms of quality from here on out. And it is very possible that this grade and all others will one day be out of date. This was always going to happen no matter what I did. Avengers history is ongoing and fluid as long as there are new comics coming out, and I prefer that would be the case. And also, the newer the books are, the harder they are to talk about in a historical context to begin with. So these last few rounds of the series are definitely more contemporary looks compared to the rest of Grading the Avengers. This is just the best I can do based on all information available to me, and we're going to go with this review. There's no point in delaying it since there's never going to be a time where it's easy to review the Avengers series as a whole. And these things that I'm talking about do matter. The newer Jason Aaron Avengers stories definitely had an effect on my overall grade, like I said. It lowered things ever so slightly. Aaron's Avengers are a lot of things, both good and bad. One thing that fascinates me is that when people talk about what they like or don't like about Jason Aaron's Avengers, they tend, as I find, to focus on only a handful of things, completely ignoring huge parts of the series and stuff that it really consumes the attention of other readers. So I find one reviewer who really seems to like this whole idea of the Squadron Supreme, introduced in Aaron's books as puppets of Mephisto, as being this sort of satire of the New 52. And while I personally think that parody stuff is trivial and barely an important part of the Avengers series, to this reviewer, it's the most important aspect of Aaron's book. Other people focus a lot on Aaron's newer roster, consisting of a wide range of characters from Avengers history, like Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, Black Panther, She-Hulk, Captain Marvel, and newcomers Ghost Rider and Blade, ignoring that Aaron also created a whole new team of Avengers that apparently existed back in caveman times. And as for the critiques of the present-day roster, it is, in my opinion, one of the strongest to date. A nice balance of characters from throughout Avengers history, while also featuring fun choices, like the decision to make Black Panther the head of the team, allowing Carol, Tony, and Steve to sort of take on a more supporting role, while also setting aside all their tremendous baggage with each other and horrible decisions they've made over the years. We also get a new base for the Avengers Mountain, which is actually the frozen corpse of a long-dead Celestial. Aaron presents us with this series featuring a whole new set of Avengers mythology. New headquarters, a team utterly divorced from American politics and now far more firmly associated with Wakanda and the rest of the world, new ideas about why humans in this world have these superpowers to begin with, and what that all means. I love it. The choice to make humanity's unique role in Marvel's universe more of a cosmic accident than us being super special starflower children is so much better, and is a far more elegant execution of existing Marvel cosmic mythology. These changes make the narrative a bit more of something where humanity and its path forward are kind of on them. We as the human race have been given all these amazing gifts, and it's up for us what we might do with them. It's a solid message. If you can't tell yet, I really like Jason Aaron's Avengers, which is a bit of a problem because, as best as I can tell, most fans and critics simply do not. That gets into what I was saying though earlier about how people tend to focus on individual aspects of the series without considering everything on the whole. What's worse is nobody ever seems to talk about the most important parts of these Avengers. Mainly that Aaron takes a ton of time to just let the Avengers breathe. Between all these stories that by now are pretty par for the course for the Avengers in terms of epicness, Aaron does something few other Avengers writers do, which is let their characters take a break between these big epic stories and react to them. Whole issues might be devoted to the Avengers going to a hot spring together. For one book, Carol takes Robbie Reyes out for a fishing trip because he had a really rough time with their most recent adventure and he's new to the team. It's a beautiful moment that I wouldn't trade up for just about any other moment in Avengers history. It's also a good example of Carol being consistently written far more human and warm than just about any other writer in Avengers history. These little moments, while they have happened in past books, feel so much rarer across Avengers history compared to how Aaron so consistently takes time for these things. And that matters so much to me, compared to just about any other critique people have for the series. Avengers, at its core, is about a team of characters, so how these characters are written and interact with each other matters so much. So when people have gripes about the identity of the roster, the books aren't making whatever political point they're projecting into things, or start nitpicking it, I think they've lost sight of what the Avengers are really about. The team should never be focused on parodying the Justice League or telling the most epic stories possible. It should always be about quality character work. There's a reason why the most memorable thing in all of Avengers Age of Ultron, even though it's this big expensive movie, is all the Avengers at a party, rather than anything with Ultron. So even in the relatively weaker, newer stories like some of the stuff with Moon Knight and Phoenix, well, in between those issues we're still getting all this great character work. And because that's done so well, everything else to me, be it good or bad, is either icing on the cake or easily ignorable. The Avengers of 10,000 BC or whatever they're called are great, and I especially like the standalone issues we got once in a while that focuses on one member of the team individually, or that great story where Tony Stark gets sent back into time and has to live in that setting for a single book. These books are solid writing, example of perhaps some of the strongest single issues in all of Avengers history. Structurally well written, but also very creative in their ideas being fronted. Even a relatively weaker story like Moon Knight is full of ideas and imagery that I just love. And yeah, it's not the strongest story in the world, but I sure enjoyed myself. Between Moon Knight running around, seizing all these domains of power at the beginning of the story, seeing an Earth conquered and controlled by Khonshu, and the fun of the Egyptian deity slowly going mad as he battles endless waves of Mephisto, there's so much to enjoy here. It's an excellent Avengers arc that easily beats out entire runs that we've talked about in this series before. Because this is, at the core, what the Avengers have always been. A quirky set of imaginative adventures, but now with better character writing than perhaps anything outside of Hickman's work. And of course, Hickman's Avengers are an entirely different, higher quality breed. And that's okay, he was going for this big, dark story, and Jason Aaron's writing is clearly trying to be more fun. It, in my opinion, seeds very wildly at that fun. I had so much joy in my heart when I read these Avengers books, and that continues to be the case every time I read a new one. I remember being skeptical about a lot of these things when the Avengers of Jason Aaron's era was all new. The Avengers Mountain, She-Hulk's character changes, S.H.I.E.L.D. transitioning over to the Agents of Wakanda, the Caveman Avengers, but it all, in my opinion, was very well handled. It certainly helps that this art does such a great job at working with Aaron's tones. With an army of extremely talented names backing him up, including notable favorites of mine Sarah Pichelli, Ed McGuinness, David Marquez, and Andrea Sorrentino, along with Jason Masters, Stefano Caselli, Luciano Vecchio, Eric Arcanigia, Paco Medina, Mark Morales, and Javier Garron. Along with many others, they bring this dynamic visual flair to this era of Avengers I just love. The style of these artists tends to go for a more cartoony direction, and though that fits with the general tone of the Avengers, especially as Jason Aaron's writing them, these artists do a pretty good job at also making things feel more epic or darker when the series calls for it. Historically, Aaron is a pretty dark and weird writer, and was an interesting choice for the Avengers from the beginning. Every once in a while we do get a bit of that dark flair, and he does go places with this series. It's not anything nearly as dark or formidable as Time Runs Out, and again, doesn't really feel like it wants to be that, nor is it as smart as that, but it manages to balance all these ideas and different tones better than Hickman ever really did. It's often funnier than most other Avengers books from before, and of course it does all that excellent character development stuff that I really appreciate. I feel a little alone on this one. I know that most comments I read from the comic book community is a lot more down and critical of this era of Avengers than I ever will or can be. Every time I hear people critique these books though, I just think about how important the character development scenes are and how lacking they feel in past Avengers books. I just love the stuff Stan Lee, Roy Thomas, Roger Stern, Kurt Busiek, and Jonathan Hickman did with the Avengers, but they don't ever spend time on this stuff. We might get a glimpse of the Avengers' daily routine before they're thrust into the next adventure, but Jason Aaron devotes time to actually show us what the Avengers are up to in between these big stories. He lets his series take a moment and reflect on things. He lets there be a reaction in the team and the world around them to the events that happen in his story. If more Avengers books did stuff like that, then maybe they would also get good grades. And I understand perfectly well that these books have problems. They go for these big, epic stories and just sort of quickly abandon everything near the end. Aspects of the mythology feel drawn out, some characters have gotten a lot more development than others, and worst of all, some of the dialogue is just plain awful. Jason Aaron's Avengers is a weird combination where a lot of the character work and overall stories are decent, but the actual dialogue, especially these Joss Whedon-style one-liners all the Avengers have throughout Jason Aaron's time in the series, are just so bad. Jason Aaron is not good at this type of dialogue, and never really has been. These little bits of dialogue are generally unwelcome, and by far my least favorite aspect of his Avengers. They often come across as out of character, and when I talk about the series being funny, I sure as hell am not talking about these quippy little lines. They really take me out of the series, and absolutely lowered the overall grade. So don't get me wrong, his books are far from perfect. However, the thing is, Aaron's Avengers does a lot of stuff that other Avengers books in the past simply don't. They don't care about following up on their own stories. They don't let their characters go fishing, even for a few pages. They certainly don't have an imaginative new headquarters and an exciting new leader who earned his place in that role, or a bunch of very interesting new ideas for the series. Jason Aaron does all these things and more. So yes, his books are flawed, but not so flawed that it overrides the stuff that it does incredibly well. People in media have a tendency not to like the most recent creative teams on a franchise, and I'm going to push a little bit that that's going on here. Most criticisms I've seen against the Avengers seem to be less about the quality of certain choices in the writing or the art, and more about people not getting what they expected out of the series. But if we're going by the quality, if we're going by how fun the villains are, how cool and memorable the stories have been, and how well the team is written, by and large, Jason Aaron does it better than most historical Avengers writers for the core series, beaten out by only a handful of Titans. Now, of course, everyone is welcome to disagree with me, In fact, no grade in this little run of videos we've done has gone without dispute from somebody. It feels especially relevant for a run like this that I admit has a lot of pros and cons to it. It feels like something like this is going to be polarizing, so I really don't expect everyone to agree with me. I love this run of Avengers, but I love it in spite of a lot of flaws, and I recognize that. For everything it does right, I do think it has some of the worst dialogue in Avengers history, for example. But it speaks to me enough that I just don't care about the flaws nearly as much as I care about the strengths. So I went with my heart and gave it a good grade. I hope people can understand and respect that, because there you have it. Those are my grades and thoughts on the entire core series run of Avengers comics. And I think from here, we need one more video to kind of go over everything, do sort of a final little report card, my thoughts on all these reviews and how the Avengers have changed over time. We'll look at the grades like on a little graph like that and see if like the grades have gone down or if there is any trend we can notice. In between then and now, if you guys want to start sharing some of your own grades, I might also kind of include that. So please feel free to do so in the comments section below if you haven't read every single era of Avengers. Don't worry about it. Just focus on the ones you guys have done before, because it's also subjective. I do kind of want to hear from other people and have somewhere in this series at least some consideration for what other people think of it. So if you made it this far, if you are one of those fans who's been loyal to this series and really been watching it, I think you deserve a say, and you should be able to comment with your grades and thoughts on the series now that I've had my say over and over again for the last however many months. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you all so much for watching this series. I really wasn't sure what the reaction would be to it, whether people would like it or want 23 rounds of it. And I don't know if this would have come out nearly as quickly or reliably if it weren't for all those encouraging comments and stuff that I got throughout the run of these videos. So I really appreciate that. Next up, for grading something, after I kind of finish off the Grading the Avengers, like I said, we've got another video or two coming out for the series just to sort of wrap things up. But we're going to move over to DC, obviously, just to be fair. And it's already kind of been decided. I don't really remember how I came to this decision, but it has already been decided. We're going to be going to Teen Titans. But for those who have been asking, because I've gotten a lot of comments about this, more than usual even, we are also going to revisit the Avengers one day for a whole other grading series where we focus on the side series. Your West Coast Avengers, Great Lakes, and also stuff like the Ultimates, anything like that I didn't really include here. So, that was a long review. I don't know what the actual final runtime of it all is. This is nearly a half-hour recording, which is actually not as long as I thought it could be, but a little bit longer than usual. But I assume this round is going to be more elaborate, which makes sense. It's a longer running series than the most current run, but also maybe it's hard to let go. I'm going to miss this, and it was fun to do. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.